US President Joe Biden meets with Polish President Andrij Duda as the Ukraine conflict enters its second month. Hello, I'm Anton, and this is The Heat. Members of NATO, the European Union and the G7 nations gathered in Brussels, Belgium this week to strategize Western responses to the ongoing crisis in Ukraine. US President Joe Biden is now in Poland on the last leg of his European trip to assess the refugee crisis. Most Ukrainians fleeing the conflict have taken refuge in Poland. Saturday, Biden will deliver what the White House is calling a major address from Warsaw, the capital of Poland. We begin with this report from CGTN's Jim Spellman.
U.S. President Joe Biden overnights in Warsaw. Earlier, he met with aid groups in eastern Poland, just about 100 kilometers or so from the border with Ukraine, there to get a first-hand look at the efforts to help some of the millions of people that have been forced to flee Ukraine in recent weeks. The U.S. has committed to taking 100,000 Ukrainian refugees, but of course many more ending up in Poland and other parts of Europe. Joe Biden says security concerns have made it impossible for him to actually go to Ukraine.
I'm here in Poland to see firsthand the humanitarian crisis, and quite frankly, part of my disappointment is that I can't see it firsthand like I have in other places. They will not let me, understandably, I guess it, cross the border.
Biden is expected to meet firsthand with some refugees in Warsaw on Saturday. Biden also met with U.S. troops stationed in Poland. The president, the White House have repeatedly said there will be no U.S. boots on the ground in Ukraine, but that if a NATO country like Poland were to be attacked by Russia, we could expect to see a NATO response. Before leaving for Poland, the U.S. and the EU announced a new joint task force to reduce European reliance on Russian energy. Two goals here. First, to speed the transition to renewables to bring down the overall need for fossil fuels. And the second, more short-term goal, to find other sources of energy for Europe. That means we can expect to see increased imports of liquefied natural gas from the United States and other sources. Listen.
We're coming together to reduce Europe's dependence on Russian energy. Putin has issued Russia's energy resources to coerce and manipulate its neighbors. That's how he's used it. He's used the profits to drive his war machine.
The goal here, to cut Russian imports of energy into Europe in half by midsummer. But there's a global capacity issue. There's simply not enough natural gas created around the world to meet the world's needs and Europe's needs without some Russian energy in the mix. To completely cut off Russian energy flowing into Europe would mean severe economic consequences. Jim Spellman, CGTN, Washington.
Lots to discuss. Let's bring in our panel. Joining us here in Washington, D.C., Anton Fedyashin is a professor of history at American University. Also in the U.S. Capitol is Max Blumenthal. He is the editor of The Gray Zone, an independent news website. From Berlin, Germany, Ulrich Brueckner is the Jean Monnet Professor for European Studies at Stanford University in Berlin. And in New York is Andrij Dobriansky. He is the chair of United Nations Affairs at the Ukrainian World Congress. Welcome to all of you to the show. Andrij Dobriansky, let me start with you. As we've just been reporting, NATO leaders have been meeting in Brussels. President Biden also held a meeting with EU leaders. G7 leaders have been meeting. NATO has announced more deployments to Eastern Europe, or the NATO member states in Eastern Europe, and President Biden, of course, is holding those meetings in Poland. Question is, does any of this change the status of the conflict in Ukraine?
Again, I think you're getting to the point of the question with your question, which is the fact that all of these deployments aren't really about what's happening in Ukraine. They're about making sure that Europe is more secure, whether it's the deployments of NATO troops dispersed throughout the eastern flank, whether that's the additional transition away from fossil fuels from Russia to American-supplied natural gas. As far as Ukraine, we aren't seeing the IOM on the ground for monitoring the displaced people. We're not seeing enough international aid agencies going directly into Ukraine. And I fault the president for not stepping into Ukraine because a number of world leaders have taken the trip into Ukraine, directly into the capital, or else have gone by the border at least. That's something that should have been accomplished. Hopefully it still will be accomplished before he leaves.
So this big diplomatic mission by President Biden, would you describe it as a disappointment?
Well, we're waiting for additional aid, so as the more aid comes in, the better. But I would think that the first president to visit Ukraine since Vice President Biden came as vice president, or else since George W. Bush, it's been an enormous amount of time. American presidents have neglected visiting Ukraine, and this time, when other world leaders are doing it, it should fall upon the leader of the free world to visit Ukraine.
Max Blumenthal, NATO is talking very tough. It's deploying more troops to the East European members of NATO. Weapons continue to flow into Ukraine from the United States, from European members of NATO as well. But there is no talk of any kind of diplomatic solution to this conflict, some way of negotiating the two sides out of this. Why do you think that is the case?
Well, back in 2008, the current CIA director, William Burns, stated matter-of-factly that NATO expansion towards Russia's frontiers was a bright red line that would lead to a military confrontation between the West and Russia. And now here we are. Burns's prediction, along with George Kennan's prediction and the prediction of former U.S. Ambassador to Russia, Jack Matlock, have all been fulfilled. And we're seeing the price of NATO expansion. But NATO is not willing to give the Ukrainians what they want, which is a no-fly zone and a direct military confrontation with a fellow nuclear power that would lead to World War III. And so they've essentially abandoned the Ukrainian military after pushing them and the entire Maidan regime into this confrontation. It really shows how the U.S. treats its so-called allies. And Biden's trip has been nothing short of a joke. He spoke to the 82nd Airborne, I believe, in Poland, and told them that you will see when you are in Ukraine, Ukrainian grandmothers fighting Russian soldiers, promising some kind of U.S. invasion. What kind of message does that send? The only thing the White House can say now is that the president is demented. And this follows all the gaffes that Kamala Harris committed. So what we are seeing right now is the real NATO and Biden strategy, which was elucidated by Niall Ferguson, a conservative writer, who said that he spoke to a senior member of the Biden administration who said they're seeking a long-term proxy war to extend this war for as long as possible. In other words, to fight this war to the last Ukrainian.
Andrij Dobriansky, what do you make of that assessment, and also the point that Max made, and that is that Ukraine is being abandoned by the West?
That's not the case if you look at the amount of support that Ukraine has been getting from its allies. I think the big abandonment has obviously been the fact that Ukraine and Russia had a friendship treaty for over 2 decades. Ukraine and Russia had numerous security guarantees between each other. And we see that Russia is not standing by its ally Ukraine. Russia instead is invading Ukraine. And the fact that we are now discovering images of mass graves in Russian-occupied territories, 64 medical facilities destroyed by Russia, that really demonstrates, who is not living up to their agreements, which is Russia. As far as the international community, you're seeing not only international aid come in, the acceptance of these displaced people, but even Israel making sure that there's a hospital set up in Lviv for all the children. You're seeing the international community rally in support of Ukraine in a way that we haven't seen in a very long time.
Right. What about that point that Max made, that it seems that the West here wants to prolong this war rather than bring it to a quick end?
Meaning that the West isn't firing on Russian positions. At this point, with Russia losing up to 10 generals, an admiral, many more commanders, and Ukraine actually having more tanks now than it did at the beginning of the war, due to the fact that Russia has abandoned so many, we're clearly seeing the fact that Russia is losing this war, and therefore the end is in sight for the Ukrainian army.
All right, that's one point of view, but there are others who say that Russia is not losing, and I want to get to one of those points with Anton Fedyashin. Anton, Russia has just said that it's completed what it calls the first phase of this battle in Ukraine. What do you understand that to be?
Well, first of all, it sounds like a face-saving measure in the sense that if Russia expected the government of Zelensky to fold very quickly after a few days in the beginning of the invasion, that certainly hasn't happened. I certainly wouldn't say that the Russians are losing. I don't know of a single example in the history of our species where countries, while waging war, have won every single battle and not lost commanders. So the Russians look like they are rethinking their plan. This is not good news, by the way, for the Ukrainians. It looks like the Russians will not be attempted to take major Ukrainian cities, although I'm not sure from the beginning whether that was entirely part of the plan. And the Russians are now going to focus on finishing the taking of Mariupol, which has seen by far the greatest amount of fighting and suffering and destruction. And then they're going to focus on the Donbass, on pushing the Ukrainian army and the right-wing battalions completely out of that territory. Now, they claim that they've taken 93% of the Luhansk province and just over half of Donetsk. So there's plenty of fighting to be done. And I imagine that they will be focusing on those areas, probably attempting to surround Ukrainian forces. So we'll see how things shape up in the next few weeks. However, I have to say I'm very pessimistic about this because both sides have dug in. Neither seems to be willing to compromise. And by the way, when you compare the amount of leaks about peace negotiations from last week, and we saw many of them, I checked both the Ukrainian and the Russian news this week, there have been no leaks and an absolute dearth of information about any progress in the peace talks whatsoever.
Anton, initially, Russia announced several goals that it wanted to accomplish. One was independence for that eastern part of Ukraine. The other was Ukraine becoming a neutral state. Also, Russia wants Ukraine to recognize that Crimea is now part of Russia. If Russia is now going to focus its interests on the eastern part of Ukraine, does it mean that it's actually narrowed its goals?
Yes, that may very well be, because the negotiations are going to be very difficult. Russia's taken enough territory to create a massive problem for the Ukrainian government. I mean, again, if you look at a map of how far the Russians have progressed in the south, in other words, north and out of the Crimea, they've taken enormous swaths of territory, including with the linking up of the Russian and the rebel forces in eastern Ukraine, and they're linking up around Mariupol. They've cut off Ukraine from the Azov Sea completely. So these are not minor gains, and they've come at a huge cost for the Ukrainian people and for the Russian military. But they have made gains, and now they're going to try to leverage them against the Ukrainian government. It's going to be exceedingly difficult for the Ukrainians to carry on negotiations. And the economic war of attrition that we see all of Europe descend into is not going to be easy for Europe either. We're seeing protests in Spain and Albania. Those are going to increase. And it's no party in Russia either. So this is turning into a political endurance contest, and the jury's still out on how this will end.
Ulrich Brueckner, during his visit to Europe, President Biden said the single most important thing we have to do in the West is to be united. Do you believe that the West is united in this approach to the war in Ukraine and what Russia is doing? Because it would appear that European nations are far more vulnerable to Russian counter-sanctions than the United States is.
Well, the West is by definition never united because we are not a single authoritarian system. We are a group of sovereign states. We have different history. We have shared values. We have similar political systems. But the way we respond to challenges in a free speech culture is that we sound like a cacophonic orchestra. So what we currently see in the West is a very exceptional moment, and that is the big achievement of President Biden's visit to Europe, that the West stands united, and he announces that this will last long enough to win the conflict.
Germany has been at the center of this because Germany imports more than 50% of its energy needs from Russia. What is the German response to what is happening right now?
Well, we had a government that announced from the start, when the war was still far away, to be an option, that it will transform the German energy dependency, not because it was considered to be a security risk, but because of climate change, into something like a fossil-free economy. And that's why we start from the beginning of the new government, which is just in power for 3 months, to transform the entire basis of the German economy. And now they frantically try to do it faster than anyone has ever expected. And this is what we are currently seeing, and it ruins the Russian economic model, which is based on selling fossil fuel.
Andrij Dobriansky, you were telling us earlier about the status of the war as the Ukrainians look at it, but as I said a moment ago, Russia says that it has completed the first phase of the war as far as it's concerned. What are you seeing and hearing about the situation in Ukraine, especially around the capital, Kyiv?
The fact that the Russian forces cannot possibly move any further in. At this point, their resupplies are dwindling down to nothing. As I mentioned before, Ukraine has actually captured more tanks and now has more tanks in its possession for its military forces than it had at the beginning of the war. But the most important part is the fact that Russian forces are suffering so badly with more than 50% of their rocket attacks failing to hit their intended targets or not even exploding on impact. Unfortunately, they are still aiming these rocket barrages, these missile attacks from far outside of Ukraine onto Ukrainian civilian areas. The fact that so many civilian areas clearly marked of containing children, and 64 medical facilities. Right. We are in a crisis mode with the fact that 80,000 women are expected to give birth in the next 3 months, according to the United Nations. And the fact that all these medical facilities are being targeted is why organizations like USAID is providing maternity wards, mobile maternity wards, but they're not going to be enough.
Andrij, one of the things that distinguishes this war is the fact that there is so much misinformation, so much disinformation about what is going on. And you've just told us about the situation in Ukraine and the losses that the Russians have suffered. What is the source of your information?
The Ukrainian military is reporting this on a daily basis. The news organizations can verify what they can verify, but the main source of this are the dead Russian bodies. I mean, at this point, the Red Cross has been asked to come into Ukraine to take care of dead Russian soldiers that the Russian army does not want to deal with. This is self-evident, much like the open source satellite images that we see of mass graves now in Donbass that have been verified by the United Nations, and they want to have a team go in there to verify these mass graves.
Anton, Fedyashin, have there been similar reports in Russia about these losses?
Not in terms of numbers, but today the Ministry of Defense, I saw part of the briefing, did quote figures of about just under 1,400 soldiers dead, over 3,000 wounded. There's no reason to believe these figures, to take them at face value. But then again, you know, the other edge of the figures that we hear from NATO is between 7,000 and 10,000 Russian troops lost. The Ukrainians are declaring 15,000, and the very spread of these losses should tell everyone that we're operating in a fog of war. We will find out the figures eventually, but it's almost impossible to really get your bearings about this right now.
Max Blumenthal, there's been much reporting in the Western media, particularly in the US media, over the past few weeks about chemical laboratories in Ukraine, specifically Russian claims that the United States is financing bioweapons labs in Ukraine. This in turn has led to US warnings that Russia should not mount any kind of chemical weapons attack in Ukraine. What do we know about this?
Well, there have been so many false stories so far that have been reported in US media or touted by US members of Congress as true. The Ghost of Kiev, an imaginary fighter pilot who took down 40 Russian jets, the Snake Island fantasy of 13 Ukrainian border guards telling off a Russian warship before dying rather than surrender. They actually were captured and it never happened. And so we have to be questioning everything, every single claim, particularly when it comes from Ukrainian nationalist lobbyists. And so when we hear the Ukrainian lobby in the United States or the Ukrainian government call for a no-fly zone, or we hear the neo-Nazi Azov battalion in Mariupol begging for a no-fly zone from NATO, it's because of the weakness of the Ukrainian military situation and the quandary that they find themselves in, particularly in the east, not because they're having some great success against Russia's much larger military. And the chemical weapons allegations or foreshadowing of some sort of chemical weapons attack are of a part with this desire to trigger a NATO military intervention. We saw the same thing from the armed Syrian opposition in order to trigger Western opposition by tripping the red line, this ill-fated policy imposed by Obama. And we saw in Duma, Syria, for example, in April 2018, a clear false flag event, a staged event that triggered UK, US, and French missile strikes. The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons sent inspectors to the ground. They did not find any chlorine attack. What they found was evidence of staging, and we're starting to see it again. So it's incredibly dangerous when we hear Joe Biden or Tony Blinken or Linda Thomas Greenfield, the UN ambassador, laying the groundwork for another kind of chemical deception. And I think that's what we need to watch out for, because it's really the only hope of the Ukrainian military right now is direct Western military intervention, which would be pretty disturbing for the future of humanity.
Ulrich Brueckner, there's been quite a lot of speculation in the media here in the United States about this war expanding. It could possibly involve NATO at some stage and ultimately involve the use of nuclear weapons. In fact, the New York Times reports that both the United States and Russia have small nuclear bombs, which in the words of the New York Times, makes their use less frightening and more thinkable. What do you make of that? Is there such a thing as a small nuclear war?
Well, Europe is a densely populated area, and Putin speculates that the two sides of a war, that it's on the one hand a matter of how hard you can hit, and on the other hand, how much you can endure, is the lack of endurance on the European side. So if there's something happening like an A, B, or C attack, it's the Europeans that will step back because they cannot handle it, which is very different in a totalitarian system. So if Putin will feel cornered because he's far from achieving any of his very ambitious goals, then the threshold of using something that is another level of escalation is far more likely than we would have ever expected.
Anton Fedyashin, what do you make of this talk in the media about the use of nuclear weapons? Because there was an interview that the Kremlin spokesman gave to a US cable news station in which he said, look, Russia will use nuclear weapons under only one circumstance, and that circumstance is an existential threat.
Yes, that's right. Listen, it's understandable that people are talking about this because it has everyone profoundly rattled, and for good reason. I don't remember the last time that the world had a serious conversation about even the possibility of nuclear weapons. But I think it's important to distinguish between two things here, between signaling and threats. And it seems to me that the Kremlin has certainly signaled, that if it comes to an existential question of Russian survival, it will use nuclear weapons. Whether they're tactical or strategic, they didn't distinguish, but Putin did place Russia's nuclear forces, defensive forces, I have to underline here, on alert earlier in the war. This is not a healthy conversation to have for anyone and for any leader to consider using these weapons, but it shows us just how far this conflict has come. And ultimately, look, Anand, it was diplomacy that would have been the strongest deterrent to this calamity in Ukraine breaking out. And it's still diplomacy that will be the ultimate solution. Unfortunately, I don't see any side taking it seriously. And even during the multiple meetings that President Biden had with his allies in Europe, there was really less talk about peace than anything else. Only President Macron mentioned the possibility of a diplomatic solution in his press conference yesterday.
Max Blumenthal, during his address to U.S. troops in Poland, I want to play you some of what President Biden had to say. Let's listen.
We're in the midst of, and I don't want to sound too philosophic here, but you're in the midst of a fight between democracies and oligarchs.
So that's what the U.S. president has distilled this conflict down to, a fight between democracies and oligarchs.
Sounds like the fight we face here internally in the United States. I mean, but what I think Joe Biden was trying to say, first of all, is that first, only Russia has oligarchs. What we have here are philanthropists like Bill Gates or businessmen like Jeff Bezos. So it's a very American exceptionalist talk. But the way that people around Biden, especially the hardliners, the Victoria Nulands or the Anthony Blinkens, think is in a bifurcated kind of Cold War way, where the U.S. represents the democracies of the West, and then you have the global evildoers of Russia, it could be in Latin America, Cuba, China, and that makes them so hostile to negotiation, but also, and we've seen no talks apparently between Blinken and Lavrov so far, but it makes them hostile to negotiation, to understanding the security needs of countries like Russia, and they see the world in an antiquated way. And this is incredibly dangerous talk. It's World War talk, and it's coming from someone who actually should know better, but it's hard to know what Biden believes these days. We are in a new Cold War, and what Biden and his people fail to understand is what Larry Fink of BlackRock said, which is that this war that's taken place in Ukraine actually means the end of globalization and the beginning of a new economic order that's moving away from the U.S.
Yeah. Andrij Dobriansky, sorry, just to have about a minute, just under a minute left, but what's behind President Zelensky's move to ban 11 political parties in the country and shut down some TV stations?
There's currently a war. There are over 100,000 Russian troops, and 64 medical facilities have been bombed. So in terms of banning things that are in the line of Russian influence, those are standard operating procedures during a war. At this point, we don't even know how long broadcast television will remain in Ukraine, so long as those facilities are being bombed.
So bottom line is you abandon democracy when you're at war.
I don't see any pretense for that. We know that Ukraine has maintained elections throughout this 8-year war against it, and those elections have been all declared as fully recognized by other countries.
Okay, and we have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. I'm Andrij in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.